So a phone call came in to me a couple of years ago after business hours, and I instinctively knew right away in my gut what was about to happen to me. And I thought, here it comes. And then again, that old familiar nauseous, sickening feeling beginning in the pit of my stomach and making its way up into my throat. I'd felt this feeling so many times in my life before, and here it was happening again. And I hated it. It wasn't a friend to me. It isn't a friend to me, and it calls itself rejection. And if you're anything like me, you haven't lived this long without having experienced rejection at some point in your life. We've all had that experience of not having our needs met for one reason or another. It's just the degrees that vary. But with rejection, no matter how big or how small it is, the pain of it can go just as deep and hurt just as much. And it isn't any less significance regardless of its beginnings. And many times it comes to us from those who are supposed to be the ones that love and protect us, like our own parents. It took me many years to come to realize and accept the fact that my parents really had their own unmet needs, their own unmet hurts, and they really lacked the capacity to truly love me unconditionally. And the reason that I share this tonight is because the events that happened really triggered some real vulnerability in my life, and it showed me where I was getting in my own way. I really had to sit back. It took a few months to really sit back and look at the patterns that were happening. I'll share more as we get in through the evening. But being willing to be vulnerable has everything to do with being an effective change leader. And I believe leadership is a calling. It takes real courage, it takes discipline, and leading change is even more ambitious and can be even more crazy and exacerbate things. Those of you who are familiar with Brene Brown's writings and things like that, she talks about rumbling with vulnerability, and that you really can't have courage as a leader without rumbling with this vulnerability. And I really love the terminology, because when you really do start to look and be intentional about being self-aware, some of this stuff can really come up to the surface, and it is a rumbling. So we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. So I don't know if all of you have seen this statistic in the past, but 70% of change initiatives fail. That's a phenomenal amount of money every year, not realizing its benefits to organizations. And that to me is just, it's heart-wrenching. But when you also talk about the cost, not only to the business where there's deadlines missed and projects not being met and things like that, but there's a real cost to the people side. And I'd like to ask you all, just call out, or you can type it in the chat room, whichever you're comfortable with. What do you guys think is some of the cost as a leader, to you as a leader, on the people side of change when it's not managed well? Any thoughts there?
Well, people shut down, and so they don't offer additional solutions. So it's not only what you're currently working on that doesn't succeed, but any other possible growth is also cut short before it even gets started.
Yeah, thanks, Lori.
They fight versus adopt.
Fight versus adopt, okay. Heather Forrest said trust. I'm assuming breaking down trust, Heather.
What I was going to say.
Other thoughts?
Lose your high performers.
Losing, and losing meaning actually they're exiting the organization, Susan?
Yes.
Yeah. That's a huge cost, a huge cost. Any other ideas? Loss of losing credibility. Pat, when you say that, can you say a little bit more about that? Pat Schaefer?
Sorry, I was having trouble with my cursor not
Mute.
wanting to unmute. Yeah, I think that people lose their faith in a leader's ability to lead. They really just begin to say, you know, this guy doesn't know anything more than I do. Why is he in that role? That's what I mean by losing credibility. You know,
Thanks.
people no
The
longer
leader.
see you. People no longer see you as the leader.
Thank you. Yeah.
Which was
Other
getting,
thoughts?
I had said
Barbara?
loss of respect, which gets, I think credibility is more the word of it, that you no longer are perceived as a real leader. People will, they may not really listen to you. They may decide to go on their own. Work
Yeah.
around you.
Yeah.
Which is
Any-
sabotage. I mean, which sabotages your efforts if they're working around you.
Yeah. Some of the other ones that I have thought of that have people impact, but people impact in general, some of them you guys have already covered, but obviously productivity, morale decreases, loss of trust, the idea of losing valuable employees, as Susan mentioned. Formal change initiatives introduce one of the highest risk factors for loss of key talent. And because it's about that engagement that decreases. And in today's working world, although I don't know what COVID's had as far as impact, but talent is extremely hard to find. And even though I'm thinking that people, the right talent for people that they need, the specific skill sets, and I'm thinking that even with COVID, there's still going to be a challenge to find good skilled people. So that whole thing about employee engagement, everybody's, seems to be on the bandwagon about talking about employee engagement right now and doing assessments and all that kind of thing. But I really think that that is one of the key things that needs to really be thought about when you're talking about implementing a change process. And it's oftentimes the last thing that's really thought about. So what is the secret to increasing engagement and ultimately retaining your talent? And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But I do want to spend a little bit of time saying, well, if we know all of this, that change management, that change efforts fail like this, and all of the implications that come about because of it, why do you think that people aren't doing it better?
Because change is an emotional thing.
Okay.
And I I'm a firm believer in, William Bridges' work that basically says that most people think of change as being the start or being it's the end of something. It's not the start of something. And people have a real emotional response to change. And so intellectually they may know the things, but it may seem really overwhelming to them from a personal point of view. They get stuck.
Yeah, good, Barb. Yes.
That's a good point, Barb. I think from a leader's perspective, when you're leading the change, I think it depends where your background is and what you have gone through and how you look at the change, so you can get others to do it. And you may not have a favorable view of it yourself. Tricia, are you showing slides at all?
Yes. Are you not seeing them?
We're not
No.
seeing.
No.
You're not sharing.
Missing all this good stuff.
That's okay.
here.
I thought you were. I was trying to get you on the chat. That's good.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hang on one second. Let me
Yeah.
I thought
see
you
what
were
I can-
doing just fine without the slides.
I know, she's so good. Well, while she's doing that, I mean, are there others that have comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the failures I've seen anyway are to engage the employees in the process early. Leadership comes with their knowing what the endpoint is already, and really doesn't give the employees an opportunity to participate and engage. And it's really hard to build support when you've cut them all out of the process at the beginning.
Yep.
I work in IT, and
we always say people, process, and technology, the triad that is necessary to be successful. But the people side, believe it or not, is the hardest to actually define and get moving, but it can be the single most important thing to actually make a change succeed, in my experience of doing SAP implementations and large things around the world. It will make or break a change from being successful, I think, the people side.
Absolutely.
To support what Maria said, I think part of it also is we don't change our paradigm. So, the definition of lunacy, doing the same thing and expecting a different result. And I think for me, it has come out a lot with these Black Lives Matter. I always thought I was the most diversity-oriented person and open-minded, and I don't have any unconscious bias because I know enough about it not to. And as I'm going through these programs and I'm thinking, oh my God, I do see the world as a white person because that's the only world I've ever been part of. So the solutions that I reach out to are based on my paradigm, my past experiences. And unless I'm willing to change those assumptions that I make, I may be doomed to making the same mistakes over and over again, making little tweaks, but not significant change.
And that's a really important point, Lori. I think one of the things some of the things that I'm thinking about why it's not being done more effectively, that is one of the things that there's been people have been subject to some really bad change activities and change initiatives. And so they have a really bad taste in their mouth. The whole notion of being conscious of people, I think, I don't know if it was Joe or Joy was bringing it up, but lack of knowledge, people don't understand how to do it. Impatience, people aren't willing to spend the time that it takes for this. Lack of leveraging the voices, as you mentioned. Lots of change happening too fast. And people are just burnt out on change. Things are changing so fast anymore. People just don't have time to adopt often. Is my screen now showing?
Yeah. It is.
Okay, perfect. Did anybody else have some other thoughts on why leaders are not doing this very well?
I think I think this would dovetail a little bit. I agree with all that's been said, but I think this dovetails best into what Joe was mentioning, which is transparency. So if you don't involve your people to some degree, even if it's a very quiet acquisition or merger, there is a time that you can start to share things with your team and be more transparent, and that will give them confidence and trust in you, from that point. I think that can't be overstated. People want to feel that they can trust.
Susan, love your cat. What's his name?
Oh my goodness. This one is Silver.
Silver. Beautiful.
Thank you. My mother, he's huge. I just got both of my mother's cats, and this is one. I'm not quite used to him.
There you go, Tricia. Change, right? She's going through a change.
Tricia?
Yes.
And it's Linda. I think another thing is people think that you'll remember what they did as a mistake. If they had a mistake or an error, they don't have I guess it goes back to a word someone earlier said about confidence, that part of growth comes from trying and failing and making these changes occur. I think people are very protective, and I think if they don't feel that, I think they're just hesitant because of that. I guess I'll leave it at that. I think it's a concern about what will people remember, that they tried and failed. And it says here 70% of the efforts do fail. So they figure by being quiet and just letting that acquisition occur, or those things that were just discussed, they'll be not remembered as having failed. So
Yeah.
It's not just, I think, remembering, but that there's some punishment that's going to come from failing. That it's better to keep your head down, don't stand out, kind of be in the middle of the pack. Like when you're driving, you don't want to be the first car speeding. You don't want to be the last car speeding. You just want to be in the middle of the stream so you don't get picked out.
I think that's probably true, Lori. I think probably in these days of Agile, hopefully we're shifting a little bit
That makes-
failing fast so that you can move.
That makes me also realize that I remember someone talking about change, and they said what tends to happen is that leaders will put so much work into, well, obviously the people who are with, quote unquote, with them, they will spend time with them. And of course they have to spend time with the people who are not with them. And they forget the people who are in the middle, who are just waiting to see what's going to happen. And what this person was saying is, if you want to get the biggest bang for your buck, to go after the people who are on the fence, right? Because if you get the people on the fence moving with you, you'll get critical mass instead of letting the people who are the naysayers lead them astray. So it's an interesting thing about thinking about where do you put your emphasis in trying to lead the change.
Well, thanks for all these thoughts. I think it's just fodder for our conversation. It feeds right into what we're going to be continuing to talk about tonight. I do want to share with you, I think that there's three key contributing factors that I see as to why leaders are struggling so much with leading change. The first one being is lack of knowledge about change management processes and tools. Unfortunately, this can no longer be left to those of us who are, change management practitioners and just hire the consultants and they come in and do their thing, because of the way change is happening, and it's such an integral part and woven into the tapestry of how organizations are operating anymore. I happen to believe that this is a key competency that everybody in the organization needs to understand. Now, the levels to which they understand it would be different. Obviously, if they're implementing it, they would need to, the ones leading it, they would need to know, the step-by-step processes, where senior executives need to still understand that there are certain phases. So there are phases with change management. There's a whole planning process that takes place where you're looking at the change readiness of the organization, you're defining all the change strategies, you're getting the change management team set up, you're looking at risk, you're starting to build your whole sponsorship plan. Those of you who do change know, can relate to a lot of this. And some of this probably will be refreshers for you tonight, but looking at all the stakeholders, who's going to really be impacted, all of those things. And then then there's a whole implementation where you're actually beginning to implement. You're implementing the strategy, you're developing a communication plan and training plan, and you're implementing that, and you're getting the sponsors all staged for coaching them, and again, establishing that risk mitigation plan. And then, unfortunately, a lot of times, particularly with technology implementations, the technology's out, we're done, the change is over. But there's a whole sustaining and reinforcing process that has to go in to make it a transition to business as usual. So in the reinforcing and sustaining, you're doing all of the analyzation. Is that a word? Analyzing how well your change was implemented. You're looking at the gaps, those people that haven't adopted as effectively as you would want them to, closing the gaps and transitioning it over to business as usual. But this piece, Barb, that you mentioned earlier about the whole emotional and psychological side of change is one of the most forgotten things. It's seen as change is seen as this very tactical, logistical thing that you go and implement. And it's so much bigger than that. There's this whole emotional side that all change is personal. And every individual in that organization that is going to be impacted by the change has to make their own personal transition through that change. And they actually have to decide that they want to do it. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this, but that is one key contributing factor that leaders really need to understand, these general change management concepts, methodologies, that there's phases. It's not just about writing a few communications and sending them out and thinking that everybody, got it. The second factor that I believe is critical is this whole idea of leadership, standard leadership skills. So even though you're in the middle of change, business still has to run, and all of those traditional leadership skills about how to manage performance and understanding how to navigate the organization and influencing and how to do strategic planning and how do we make money as a business. All of these are critical, and unfortunately, a lot of companies have pulled back on their leadership development and stopped developing some of these standard competencies. And they have people moving into leadership roles now, junior people, that haven't ever led anything, that don't have some of these baseline things developed for themselves. So that, to me, is a second critical factor. I'll just stop there. Any thoughts or comments on those two things before I start getting into the third factor? Okay.
I had a thought. I had to mute myself there. I'm finding this, that a lot of, or some companies, in fact, many companies, what they'll do is they'll hire a large, big consulting firm. Mm-hmm. And I won't say the names of the big ones, but we all know who they are. And then they will bring in the junior partners to run these change initiatives. They never work out. And then they have to, they pay them. Nothing, it went wrong. And then they call people like us on the phone to come in to fix it. So it actually brings, the fact that this is a problem brings in more business for more boutique coaches and change management people. I'm just finding that. I don't know if others on the call have found that.
Well, I think it's bringing in, but I guess I want to be of the place. First off, I don't think there's enough consultants in the world to help with all the change that's going on. There's just not. And not everybody can afford the big fours, but yet they're still dealing with change. And I want to be about teaching people how to fish instead of fishing for it, because at the end of the day, when I leave an engagement or leave a client, I want to leave them prepared to go do it for themselves. Minimize that codependency that can happen on me. And, if I did it all and just left, what has the organization gained? They still don't know how to do it. And so now that's the ideal. It doesn't always work out that way, but that's the ideal. But before I share what I consider to be the last contributing factor to the lack of success, I'd like to spend a little bit of time diving deeper into the role of the leader during the change process. So the role of a leader during the change process is extremely complex and very demanding. And as the leader, they are the real linchpin of how change really gets managed and adopted, because they're working directly with the people that need to be impacted. They're the front line to their direct reports. But think about all of these roles. So first, there's the role, the leader plays the role of the coach, has to be encouraging and supporting all the time. Then they have to be a communicator of what the change is, creating awareness, making sure that their direct reports understand about it and what's going on. Then they have to be an advocate for it, constantly promoting it, even though they themselves are going through their own transition period and may not even agree with what's going on. They have to be the promoter of it. Then they have to be the resistance manager. So when people start pushing back, they have to take time out of their day to listen to what the issues are, what the resistance, what the pushback is, temper it, understand it, and again, constantly, dealing with the pushback. Then they have to be the liaison, because those of us in the change program offices are really relying on them as leaders to be our eyes and ears in the organization. They're providing feedback to us, and we're providing updates and things to them. And then they have to go through their own transition, managing their own his or herself, figuring out, the impact to them, what's this going to be to me, learning to adapt and develop and transition their own self while they're having to deal with all of these their direct reports. And oh, by the way, they have to manage their day-to-day operations in order to achieve those business goals that they're being held accountable to. So when I think about leaders, that's why I talk all the time about how brave it is. It's a very challenging and complex thing to be a leader, and it gets exacerbated, like I said, even during change. So given that, and we know that people don't change unless they personally own it and find a reason for them to have to do something differently about it. So given all this, a key responsibility that leaders have is to create that working environment where people want to change. So how do we do that? When you look at today's work environments, what do you guys think that employees want in today's workplaces?
People that are flexible. I'm sorry.
Flexibility, okay.
I think today people are looking for stability, particularly right now.
That's a good one. Yeah, people feel generally insecure and scared. They need reassurance. Good. What else?
I think people want to feel that they're being heard and that they are trusted, whether their ideas go forward or not, that they're being heard.
Yep, valued, voices being heard.
Tricia, we have one from Susan that said purposeful work.
Yes, good one. Thanks, Maria, for keep catching the chats for me.
Oh, yeah.
Can't do it all. What else?
I was working on a presentation today that I'm going to give a little mini webinar on at some point in time. And it's talking about the whole idea of remote work. And believe it or not, in a recent survey, 98% of people would now like to work remotely at least some of the time for the rest of their career.
Wow.
Because what do you think is driving that? The work-life balance kind of thing?
Yeah, productivity, the lack of a commute, the ability to be at home if you have a sick child, those types of things. And they said that it was more important to them than working for a prestigious company, or more important than having an increase in holiday allowances, or more important even than having a prestigious role.
Interesting.
That flexibility to kind of be themselves, if you will, in their work.
Any others?
Another chat from Susan. She's worked from home for 10 years and it goes both ways.
Yeah, I've been doing it for 16 years for the most part.
I think
How
people,
about, oh, go ahead. Who was going to chime in there?
I think that people also want to be part of something bigger than themselves. And I think that social impact is going to continue to grow and grow and grow. That it's not just about oneself and one's company, but is it good for the community? Is it good for the planet? And that Oxford University had shared that any company that's not involved in social impact by 2030 will be out of business.
Who was it
I
that's...
think, can I just share one thing? I think especially for the younger millennial group, they want to work to live, not live to work.
Right.
And because they grew up with computers and they're very technology savvy, work that could probably have been done in 5 hours, they can find a way to automate it to 2 hours, and then they want to be done with work.
And they want to make a difference.
Yes, they want to make a difference. They want it to be as efficient as possible so they can really focus on the things that they want to focus on.
Yeah. Who was it that said wanted to be heard? Barbara, thank you. Yeah, this brings up for me the whole notion of people are really looking for a psychological safety, which is, if you're not familiar with that term, it's really about the ability to speak up and not fear having retribution. And during times of change, the need for this psychological safety becomes even more critical. It's multiplied. And so leaders have the most direct impact on people being willing to make a change and making it psychologically safe for people in their environment. Because we know people leave organizations, they're usually leaving their managers and leaders, not so much the organization. But people do want safety. More than anything, they want that emotional safety. And when people feel safe, they're able to make conscious decisions about changing their behavior. And we build that safety by really making that emotional connection with each individual on your team. Because when you build that real intimate connection with each person that's on your team, and they believe in you, they see that you're role modeling things, they are committed to you, and they will follow you to the ends of the earth. But a lot of it, it has everything to do with building that emotional relationship with people. And, you know, a lot of times this is kind of a shift in leadership, because leadership was just seen as management, but now the drive is really about building that connection. And nothing impacts a leader's ability to change behavior and building that connectivity than his or her own ability to be self-aware of their own triggers during change, how they're, what might be helping them, what might be hindering them. And it's how they react and respond to those particular triggers and how self-aware they are that they will have the impact. So, so this is where I believe the real change magic happens.
Tricia?
Yeah.
I'm also thinking that employees want to continue to be relevant in their field and to their company, that feel like they are part of the change, but also have their company invest, and then they themselves invest in maintaining skills, acquiring new skills, and being relevant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think all of that's important, but that whole relevancy, they could still have all of that, all the skills and all the training, Susan, and still feel that gap because they don't have that connection with their direct leader. The thing that I think people don't really understand, that those folks that are looking to implement change, is that managing change is really about changing behavior. And it's not about changing behavior towards compliancy, because we can get a lot of compliant behavior. But it's really, how do you engage people to, in their heart of hearts, they're making a personal choice to change their behavior. And that is what is crucially missing. We can set up all of the strategies and architectures of the change, have all the greatest communication plans and training plans, set up all of the performance expectations and reward. And you may get change in behavior, but a lot of times it may be compliant. And do we really want compliant behavior, or do we want people that are changing because they're making a willing decision in their heart of hearts?
It's something that, Tricia, that in leadership programs, when we get into motivation or issues that, again, in behavior, there's a true difference between compliant and commitment.
Yes.
And so there are some things that perhaps being compliant is just fine. They're usually low-level things, they're whatever, but it's just fine. But leaders do need to be able to determine what are those things that they really want to build commitment toward, because that's a whole nother level of performance.
Yeah, and in change, we refer to that because we say we always want the people to understand what we're doing. We want them to be, well, first to be aware of it, then to understand it, and then to own it, Barbara, speaking of commitment, because the ownership there is the biggest piece. You know, I had a comment though, Tricia, as you're talking, I'm focusing on business and career and entrepreneurship and all of that. But a flash just came up because I looked over at the edge of my desk and I see one of my various masks there. And I'm thinking the biggest change right now, other than, well, it does include business, but wearing these masks and, you know, understanding it, I'm aware of it, but I don't own it yet. I'm not, I just like, it's still killing me to do it, even though I'm doing it. And I'm being compliant, but I don't own it. I'm not committed to it.
Well, I'm thinking of a different C word, whether it's compliant or commitment, but I'm thinking of culture really, because at the end of the day, isn't what you're really trying to do is change the culture of the organization?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I get back to, I think you are changing the culture. Was that Rich?
Yeah.
I think. But I get a little bit more granular because trying to change a culture is like trying to move Mother Earth, you know. But if you can get people to really engage on that very personal level and make those personal changes for themselves, because what they see in their leadership, they have that connection, and they see that leader being committed to being, to looking at their own stuff and changing that and asking for help and being, you know, when they start to become self-aware as leaders and realize that's when the real change starts to happen. And when you start having those on individual levels, then you get a whole culture that's changed. So rather than, I guess I look at it from the inside out.
Well,
I agree with you, Trish, because there's a saying that is that culture is the shadow of the leader. Leaders have to change their behaviors, and then people will begin to change their behaviors to model themselves after the leader because they want to be accepted and connected to the leader. And that's when culture starts to shift. But it is all about behavior. I agree with you.
And that's why I say in my change leader model that self-awareness is the number one lever to being an effective change leader. And that's why it's bigger. It is the gear that drives everything else. And being really clear on who you are as a leader, your own purposes, your values and beliefs, but more importantly, what are the triggers that hit you, that get in your way? And so this is why I talked about my story, because in that particular situation, I was getting triggered all over the place, and I'll share a little bit more why in a moment. But it wasn't until I really sat down and thought about how this was defeating me, my triggers were consuming me, they had control over me, and really started taking stock and inventory of what I needed to do to get resolution to this. And it was a radical change in how I'm interacting with my clients now and family members and everything else. And of course, in this case, we're talking about the change leaders, but many people on this call are also consultants. So I think it applies to us as consultants, you know, the things that we may need to look at. This for me, self-awareness, you know, it's the magic bullet. And it's why I'm so passionate about really sharing about this, because you know, I've been doing this work for many, many years, and I can go out and do all that change work, but I've just seen so many times it fails because we've got leaders that are just defeating everything that we're trying to do because of their own crap getting in the way, quite frankly. So, somebody else have a comment?
Well, this may not, I have certainly seen that. But when you were talking earlier about how, you know, it's really the more emotional, intimate relationship between supervisors and their employees, I was thinking of, I have 3 or 4 supervisors that even today, former supervisors, 20 years later or whatever, I would run through walls for them today. I respect the company that I work for, but they made it so much more than that. So I do firmly believe you're right about that.
And this is where engagement's really going to happen. So without real commitment, you guys are using the word commitment, engagement, you really don't have, sustainable change. And when I'm talking with leaders, I'm like, you realize the power that you have in your hands. It's not just a title or role. You're basically raising up the future of the organization. But it has everything to do with how you are interacting with them and what you're doing for yourself. So if your goal is to become more aware, self-aware of your own behavior and your own triggers, then you have to understand a little bit more about what happens to us physically in our brains when we experience stress and are going through change and all the emotions that come out of it. So because somebody mentioned this earlier, you guys, I think Barbie mentioned the Bridges model, but all of you have probably seen these models. The change is very personal. It's very real and it's a very personal thing. And people go through all of these different emotions during change. The Bridges model, not to get into it too much, but if you aren't familiar with it, I would recommend that you read the transition book. It's a very easy read and makes so much sense that there is an ending, there is a losing of things that are letting go. People don't often realize this. And then unfortunately, this neutral zone that people move into, which feels very much like purgatory because they know something has to end, but the new doesn't look familiar yet. They're not familiar with it. So they're living in this state of purgatory. And many times companies and leaders and people themselves will want to rush through this particular phase to get to the end because it's a very uncomfortable place. But the reality is in the neutral zone, you have it's like the vortex of creativity when you're going through that. So it's important to hold yourself there and allow yourself to go through this. Change is not a linear process, as we know. And as I mentioned, things are happening physically to us, and we're gonna get into this in just a minute. But when I really started understanding what happens to us biologically, it really helped me start understanding about that. It gave me more empathy for understanding why people were quote unquote resisting. They weren't really resisting to some degree because there's probably other stuff going on behind the scenes. And again, when I really started getting in touch with it for myself, it allowed me to get in touch with that real change. So when I talk about with leaders about releasing real change, it's more than just having something work in the organization, a new technology. It's about that inside release of change that has to happen on the individual level. So again, I'm conscious of time. I just want to move through. So in order to better understand what's happening to us psychologically within the brain, we first have to look at what the architecture of the brain is about, because it informs the behaviors on how you and I act during change. And if we don't have this baseline, it's really hard to capture what the possibilities are for us when we are exploring leadership and what some of the limitations are. So I know probably all of you have seen these things before, but just as a refresher and a baseline for us to have something to talk about this evening. First off, obviously the first part of the brain is the reptilian part, the survival part. This is what keeps us alive at all costs. It's automatic. It's the oldest part of our brain. And this is what kicks in when we are in threat mode. And obviously change is threatening for a lot of people. So often people go right to this place of survival mode. Then you have the limbic center, which is really our emotional command center. It's where all of our information is stored, our memory is stored. It's where we start learning and making connections about things, associations with each other, like the sky is blue or coffee is, dark brown, that kind of thing. It's where all of our emotions live. And it is really the hormonal control center for us. This part of the brain is fundamental for all of those things that I just mentioned. And it's where a lot of our learned behaviors and biases and reactions are formed from a very early age. And then you have the frontal cortex, which is the executive functioning piece. And this is traditionally what people equate leadership with, having all of the ability to think executively. Obviously, no other mammal that we're aware of has this capability. It allows us to set those kind of boundaries that we need to set for ourselves. It operates in, not a non-reactive mode. And the best leaders are really taking and combining all of these different parts of the brain working in a balanced way. As human beings, obviously, we want to stay alive and keep ourselves alive. So that obviously is the survival part kicking in. And then we want to be able to cognitively think and plan for new experiences, and we make associations. That's the limbic part, and then we want to be able to make those decisions in the boundaries, and that's the frontal and prefrontal cortex. Now, to further understand what happens to us during changes we're experiencing today, both you and your direct reports to your clients, we need to understand a little bit further about how the brain develops. Without going into a lot of detailed science about this, development starts in the survival part of your brain. And it usually goes from about 0 to 13 years old, it's developing. And then there's an interesting twist that happens. And rather than continuing up through the limbic and neocortex, the brain actually starts developing in the frontal lobe. And then from ages 13 to 25, it's continuing to flesh out the development of that frontal cortex. It's finishing up the limbic. So your brain actually takes 25 to 26 years to fully develop, which is, when you think about it, even the kids coming right out of college, their brains are still developing. And the thing about the brain, in order to develop, it depends on human relationships. What happens is the brain starts developing and looking at the areas, it takes inventory of what parts it's using the most. And it focuses primarily on developing that area. So going back to the years of 0 to 13 years, this is such a critical time period. I mean, think about what's going on at that time from the 12 to 14-year-olds. It's a pretty tense time. The hormones are kicking in and puberty is starting. But if you are somebody that's during this time is living in a really stress-filled or toxic environment where you're constantly in survival mode, you're either living with alcoholics, or you've got parents that are divorcing, or there's physical and emotional abuse going on in your life around that time, then that part of the brain becomes really well developed, because it's always in stress mode, it's always in survival mode. And this is what makes up the hard wiring. And this is why I share this, because my family of origin, there was a lot of physical and emotional challenge. There was alcoholism. My parents almost got divorced. And I was taught to live in this stress mode and fight, come out fighting. So when my story that I told you about, that's what I had to start looking at, what I was constantly fighting against. I had real issues with authority, which would be natural because there was a lot of abuse of authority. And we see a lot of abuse in organizations today. And I don't talk about this lightly because the statistics really show that 70% of adults in the United States have experienced a traumatic event at least once in their life. And 20% of those people go into developing post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's either likely that you as a leader have dealt with some of this stuff and have some of this stuff going on, or several of your direct reports have it going on. And again, when you think about change, that's what brings us back to change. Change creates the stress, and it produces that physical sense of threat, We all come and are made the same way to react to change. You know, it's a biological reaction. We all have the same response. But if you as a leader or have been exposed to those prolonged periods of stress in your younger years, that is how you were hardwired. If any of your direct reports, you know, have lived in that kind of situation, they're hardwired. And we get hijacked because we've learned how to think that way. So that's, and when we look at what appears on the outside, this is what we usually see, right? On the surface, when you're in an organization that's going through a lot of change, you see people lashing out, you see frustration, you see anger, all of those things. But what's really going on underneath for many people is it's hitting on areas that need healing because there's shame, there's trauma, there's depression, there's fear of rejection. So when I shared that story with you about, you know, this client that was terminating their work with me, by the way, the project was coming to an end, and I knew it was coming to an end because really, quite frankly, the work that I had to do there was coming to an end. I had done what I needed to do, but it still hit me incredibly hard because it was triggering all of this stuff underneath. I felt like I was getting rejected again. And that deep-seated rejection, again, from my story, which I don't need to go into, but you can just understand what was triggering for me. And it was consuming me and it was defeating me. I was not the best that I could be. So now, the thing is that I realized that I'm more than just a trauma survivor. But I really had to look at it, look at my stuff, lean into it, name it, and deal with it. And I'm thrilled. Quite frankly, I can say that I'm thrilled today about what I went through, because at the end of the day, it's made me and prepared me to be better at what I'm doing now as a consultant and in this kind of work. And I am so happy that I have discovered my uniqueness. And every one of us has stories that when we really leverage those uniquenesses, you know, they can make us really powerful. So the integrated change leader is really the one who understands what that innovation and creativity really depends on that psychological safety. And that psychological safety really depends upon being emotionally intelligent. And emotional intelligence does not come without self-awareness. And those change leaders that are most successful are those that are intimately embracing and becoming self-aware. They're looking at what their values are, their beliefs, and they're really learning how to leverage their own stories and transform those triggers into their gifts for each other. They understand who they are, they understand what makes them special, and they're keenly aware that many of the stories behind somebody's behavior, including their own, they need to learn to use this in a really positive way. So I go back to, again, self-awareness being that number one lever that gives you the real power to effectively, you know, move change and have others be a part of that change with you. Only you as a change, only you as a person know what your own history is, you know what your own stories are, what your own personal triggers are, and whether you're leading change or you're leading a client through change and you're interacting, the more you understand about yourself and are self-aware, what triggers you, the stronger you're going to be as a leader, because you're leveraging those the power that you have and the stories that you have. And obviously it's not an abusive power, it's a power of well-being. So once you really get comfortable in your own well-being, you're then able to really be vulnerable and transparent and have that authenticity. And that is what attracts people. That's what attracts people to you. That's what attracts those connections that people are hungering for so much in organizations, particularly direct reports. So I'm going to stop at that point and see thoughts, reactions to what I've shared so far.
Tricia, this is Jory. I'm just going to throw out there that I work for a nonprofit special education school, and we're trying to figure out now how to get the school reopened in the fall safely and successfully. And so we are right in the middle of this change management process, which will continue to change for the foreseeable future. So we'll do, let me rephrase that. We are doing some change management right now, trying to figure out what does it look like 7 weeks from now. Then once we're there, 7 weeks from now, we're going to be doing change management as the situation with COVID evolves. And a lot of this resonated with me just because I work for the CEO and I'm part of that leadership team. And I can see things that he's already doing right. And I can see areas where, you know, we as a leadership team with him in that seat can do things differently and maybe better too. So yeah, this is not like what if for me. This is now.
Yeah. Joy, are you seeing triggered, like, are you seeing what you're sensing people have triggers around things, or did any of that resonate?
I think so, but I'd have to give that some more thought. But what I'm seeing is a CEO who is traditionally a numbers person, a very analytical thinker, and he's really trying, and I see him, I think, successfully trying to pull back and think about this more from the emotional standpoint, because that's what's, and if anybody's paying attention to the news, there's a lot of emotion around kids going back to school, reopening schools, teachers working in the schools, and he's engaging. What I think he's doing well is he's engaging his team and then the next layer of leadership down from there. And I was thinking early on in your talk, probably one of the biggest challenges for the leader in this process is being able to understand the mindset and the emotional issues of the frontline workers, or the people at the, you know, lower level tiers, which in our school would be the teachers, the behavior managers, the instructional coordinators, and the clinical team. And those are all, you know, the majority of our staff. And so he's trying to do that through the people that they report to, but I'm wondering if we have to go down even lower to get into the psyches of, and we're working to do that, but wow, is that hard when you have, you know, 150 employees.
Well, and they're not the only stakeholders. Obviously, parents in the community have all of their stuff coming into the play here. So
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I will say I'm a former teacher, and I mentioned that to you, Jory, and I'm belong to the PSEA, and I get a lot of their emails. And you know, you have to give those folks an opportunity to provide input, however you do that, even if it's like a survey or whatever. Because if you don't, you know, you're going to miss things you need to know. You know, there people have to do it. They know intimately what issues they're going to be, right? And if you say, well, we're going to do this, they go, are you freaking crazy? You know, you don't want to be there, right? For lots of reasons. So there's a lot of good learning to be had, I think, from management's perspective, of things that they will just plain miss because they're not doing it every day. But also the emotional part for the frontline people. Like
and Jory, I would just encourage, as you're working with them, that you encourage them to start looking what their own stuff is, how they're reacting. There's a lot of pressure, obviously, to try and take care of the community, but they're going through their own transitions too, and they would be negligent in not taking care of themselves in this. How about other thoughts?
I was going to say to Jory, Jory, about these people that you really need to get inside of their psyches and you know, the whole thing about what the emotional piece is and how they're feeling. I tend to use influencers to do that for me sometimes. If I have a large staff or a larger group and I don't know all the people, and sometimes employees, depending on what level they are, they're not going to relate to your CEO or your CIO or whatever. So I take the people in their employee network and I use them as influencers, ones that they look up to. And they can get inside of their head, and then they come and tell me, here's what they're really thinking. Here's what their issues are. And I find that helps me. But the piece about the self-awareness, Tricia, it really opened up my eyes, because I see a lot in myself. The way that I manage change for others comes from my feelings. And I have to start now to correct some of that. This is really good for me. So, yeah.
One other comment before we move on. Anybody else have a thought?
I just want to compliment Maria because I think she's already ahead of the game. You know, she's already digging down, and that's really great. The self-awareness piece is a really revelatory to me, Tricia. I'm enjoying this. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Susan.
And this is Barbara. What's interesting to me is that I do a lot of coaching. And one of the things, I got certified and trained by the Center for Creative Leadership, who has done lots and lots of research on how successful leaders. And probably the underpinning of everything about a leader to be successful is self-awareness, which is why those nefarious 360s assessments come into play, because the whole idea of that is to give the person, I affectionately call the victim, but to give that person not only how they think of themselves, but also to get input from others. And that increased self-awareness is what will, as you have been saying with change, is what is going to deal with how a person reacts and how a person wishes to make any change in behavior.
Yeah.
You nailed it, Barbara.
Yeah. I think, innately we all know, I think too. I think the 360s are helpful. I think there's times to use them and not use them. I've certainly used them and I'm using them now, but I think most of us know what our own triggers are. And if you don't, then obviously you have to get a little bit more cognizant of that. But so I'm going to, again, just to keep us moving along, I do want to kind of move into ask you all right now to take 1 or 2 minutes on your own. Think about what we've been talking about. You can write it on a piece of paper if you want. You can make a T, like column, a T on the paper, or you can just mentally think about this and think about what are the ways that you get triggered, and how might some of those behaviors be hindering your own connection with either team members if you're a leader, or customers or clients, or even family members. So you can write that kind of on the left-hand side of the paper. What are some of the triggers and how might they be getting in the way? And then maybe on the right-hand side, you can think about what are some of the actions that I could take or suggest to my clients to take to help handle those triggers in the moment. And there'll be short-term things, short-term strategies, and then there's going to be long-term kinds of things, maybe needing to look a little bit more at the depth of what the genesis of some of this stuff, like I had to. But anyway, take a couple minutes to do that for yourselves.
Can you give me an example, like not a personal example, but just an example of a trigger, like some?
Well, I'll be personal. So I'm just kind of building on what I was sharing before, when I really began to get in touch with that. I actually had issues with authority because of the abuse of power. I would get really triggered when I saw a leader abusing his or her power, either overriding people or not allowing voices to be heard or whatever. And now, so I'm kind of realizing what that's about. And it's an automatic reaction going back to abuse of power in my own family. But now now that I know where it's coming from, I can like take a breath, remember a little bit around what it's about, and then figure out how to react in the moment. Or it's, just remembering that this person is not my mother or my father or something like. Does that make sense,
Yeah,
Maria?
thank you. Thanks for explaining it, Tricia. All right, so we're writing these down now on our own. Is that what you
Yeah,
want?
just take one or two minutes to think about this for yourself. All right, we've got about 20 minutes left here. What we do want to do at this point is have you go back into breakouts. And it'll be a short time. Maria, I think we
8
talked
minutes.
about 8 minutes, but we may have to shorten that down to 6. As much as you're comfortable in your breakouts, you're going to be in a new set with a new set of people. So don't spend a lot of time, introducing yourselves or whatever. Just kind of get right to what we're hoping you would share. As much as you're comfortable sharing, and please, this is not a therapy session. But if you feel comfortable sharing, like I did a moment ago, share with others some of your thoughts about what those triggers are for you and how those might be getting in your way. And then as a group, kind of brainstorm some strategies that you've thought about to deal with those triggers and be prepared to share those when we come back. We're going to regroup here in about 6 or 7 minutes and just talk at a really quick around what some of those trigger strategies are that you guys all have thought about. So Maria, if you want to go ahead and send them out into their breakouts. Is everybody clear?
All right. Any questions? All right, here you go.
Exciting. That's nice to know as a new member.
You know what's really nice about it is the people that I found are just wonderful, and you get valued friendships out of it. It's not always about the networking and the business.
Yeah.
It's not.
No, there it was.
Don't tell Rich that he just joined.
The part you missed was about the valued friendships, and we've formed close bonds with many people. It's really nice.
So let's talk about some of what you guys came up with. How many breakout rooms did we have, Maria?
I think we had 6, I believe.
6. Okay, we're not going to have time to get to every breakout room, so I'm just going to randomly. So breakout room number 3. Do y'all remember what room you were in? Maybe
No.
I should have told you that. And if you don't, maybe we can just kind of randomly talk about let's just do that instead of worrying about what room we were in. Strategies that you guys thought about to deal with your triggers. So again, you don't have to share what you're not comfortable with, but if you share a strategy, it might be helpful to put a little bit of context around it. So does anybody want to share a strategy?
New gal go first.
Okay.
On the disc, which I presume a lot of you are familiar with, I'm a CD, and so I tend to be a little skeptical and sometimes challenge the status quo or challenge others' decisions because I have to make a database decision. And what I tend to have to try to do is to be a more effective listener. Hear it all out, then raise my point of view or my opposite or contrarian opinion, but not lead with that, sometimes follow with that after hearing the other person out. So I have to work on that.
So Rich, are you saying you have this automatic trigger that kicks you right into, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but dismissing what people are saying, or because
not so much dismissing, but here's what I think about that rather than hearing them fully develop their thought.
Okay. But you're recognizing that it's this automatic reaction, this automatic trigger that you're going to become more aware of now.
Yeah.
Cool. Good. Others?
I think faster than I should, and so I'm trying to help but sometimes you got to listen for a while before you can help.
Okay. Triggers being, you're having some kind of an emotional reaction where there's anybody else that wants to share what you guys talked about. I know it wasn't a lot of time, guys, but.
I do have a question, Tricia. Do you find in your work that a lot of the triggers, I guess it's all part of how we are programmed, but stem from childhood or experiences like yours, experiences when you're growing up?
Well, that's kind of what I'm trying to get people to think about,
Okay.
because we can go through life and almost ignore it, and yet it's unconsciously driving and sabotaging ourselves. I mean, obviously not everybody's had the kind of background that I've had. A lot more than we think have had that kind of background have it. But no, I don't think every trigger's related to childhood or whatever. But there's probably more contributes from that kind of thing than you would typically think.
That's true. Okay.
I'm curious, when you went into your breakouts, and we know we had to cut them short because of time, but did anyone, sort of, what did you talk about? Was it hard to come up with things that might trigger you? Or did you
Oh, no, I had no problem.
Really? Can we hear about it, or not, don't want to
Sure.
share?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ones I said is not being heard is totally a trigger. I got two older brothers, and all the whole family stuff for sure. And that can become problematic when I'm working with clients, because I'm there to help them figure stuff out. And if I give them feedback and they're not listening, I'm like, what are you doing, right? And certainly when I was an employee as well. You ask me for my input, I give you valid input that you should be taking into account, and you're ignoring it. What are you doing?
Yes. Oh my God, I can relate to that.
Yeah, I'm sure I'm the only one like that, right? It's just you and me, Tricia, nobody else.
Yeah, right.
So do you think it's because the second example that you gave at work, they ask for feedback, you give it, and then nothing happens. Do you think they're just dismissing? Do you feel as though you're being dismissed out of hand? Or do you think your input is being heard, but they're just going in a different different direction? Or is that explained at all to you?
Right. So, and that's the key part of the leadership, whether or not they're a good leader. If they do the second, right, if they say, and I had a really good manager, as you had talked about before, who I'd still probably, walk through walls for, would say, I hear you loud and clear. I agree with you. And here's why it's not going to happen. Okay. Because I don't have control over that, et cetera. Right. Totally fine. Okay. Versus, okay, Joe. And then no explanation, no, interaction on acknowledging and valid or anything like that. And it just goes poof. Okay. And I had that happen a fair bit in my more recent employment. And it was all cultural crap and things going on in the way the company operated that, my boss would say things like, well, yeah, that's a good point, but I'm not going to do anything about it because I'm not sticking my neck out.
Wow.
Right. I mean, it wouldn't say it, but that was would almost say that actually. Right.
That's a culture I'd run in fear from.
Yeah. Well, I was trying to hang out until I retired. It didn't work. So.
How about one or two more shares, and then we need to move to closing. Anybody else want to share something?
Sure, I'll share. So I have experience with, I guess I would say, a leader who, in a very overbearing way, states their viewpoints as the truth and correct, and holds their views in very high regard. And I have found that I naturally react in a way of trying to bring about a feeling of, let's have open-mindedness to other viewpoints. It's kind of a place I just gravitate towards in reaction to it, because it's just, I don't believe it. Not that I disagree with their opinions, but I just don't think that one person's opinions are that correct. I think that when you're trying to seek an answer, especially, the more viewpoints you can gather, you might be able to put something together from multiple viewpoints that really is the best answer, rather than just one overbearing person telling that their answer is correct and the only and the best approach. So I just find I naturally react that way. I don't consider
you get hijacked by it, Heather?
Hijacked in what way?
Like an emotional hijack, where it's not just a trigger to let's try and be open-minded, but that it gets down, that you find yourself getting angry or anything like that?
Oh yeah, certainly. It's annoying. Sure. Sure. But I think I've done it. I've reacted in this way for a very long time, that I just naturally go into that mood of, well, let's let other people speak. Let's hear others. Let's talk it out together.
All right. Well, so thank you, Heather, for sharing. I did want to just share with you some of the strategies, and this may have been some of the things that you all talked about during your conversations. Self-compassion is really, really important, particularly when you start looking at all of this stuff that could potentially hijack you. It's really important to have self-compassion. Being okay with not being okay. We're all trying to be so perfect. And boy, the minute you start realizing that there is no such thing as perfection, talking to yourself, soothing yourself, being your own best friend, would your best friend, talk to you? Would you talk to your best friend the way you talk to yourself about things? Notice those kind of clues in your body that you're feeling, and just make sure to have compassion on yourself. Notice what that trigger is and pause, 10-second count or whatever before you react. Harriet was going to join us tonight. Harriet Stein, she does a lot of work on mindfulness and journaling. She would be, I'm sure, chiming in right about now about, dealing with the physical reactions that you're having and the ways to deal with some of these things. Self-talk, what I mentioned to you about what triggers me, what used to trigger me with leadership and authority. I had to really realize that this was just a feeling. The way the person was acting had nothing to do personally towards me. It was all rooted in other stuff, and that I had to realize that person was not, it's just a feeling that I can move through and deal with. Creating your own community where you have a lot of support around you, like executive coaches or your own network or friends that are supportive and all, and obviously therapists if you're needing to look at some of these deeper rooted things. Important, and being able to stay curious and seek feedback. These are all kind of strategies to help mitigate and manage these triggers that we have. Was there any others that people wanted to suggest also?
I like the one where you say it's just a feeling, because I think, when you say talk to yourself like you would talk to a best friend, I think we're harder on ourselves than we are on our friends. So, sometimes we can be very negative with ourselves. And when you get those other feelings or those triggering feelings, I like the fact to say, look, it's just a feeling. It's going to pass. It doesn't really mean anything. It's how you're reacting to something.
Yeah.
And that's very helpful.
It's something to take notice of. I mean, you don't want to ignore what's happening, but you don't want to allow it to control you. So,
as a coach, one of the things that I talk with the people I'm coaching is, let's say someone is working on impatience, or someone who wants to take over a meeting, or there's a tendency to, well, first of all, what tends to get people in trouble the most is not a weakness. It tends to be their overuse of a strength. Which to me is a pretty provocative thought, that it's the overuse of a strength that gets you into trouble most of the time. And so what I tell people, and I was telling my group that I have to remember this as well, is the time you need to use a different skill or a coping skill the most is when you least want to use it, right? Because you're in the throes, you're either in a groove, you're in a whatever, and so that in itself can be a trigger, a positive trigger, that when you notice that you're in a routine and that you're getting upset or whatever it is inside you, that should be almost a warning light for yourself, saying that's when you take the pause. And that's when you probably need to be using a new set of skills then to help you move through.
Yeah. Our emotions are really good barometers if something's off kilter. Yeah. Great, Barb. Thank you. What I would like to do is offer some next steps to you at this point. I would encourage you to spend some really intentional time revisiting what's important for you as a leader, as a consultant, what your purposes are, your beliefs or values, and the kind of leader you want to be, and then how you can transform those triggers into be positive gifts. So, like I said, my life story and experiences now, I'm grateful. It was not, it's the grace of God, quite frankly, has helped me to transform the things that happened to me, into really positive ways of helping others. I do want to offer to you complimentary discussion. If anybody wants to talk about this a little bit further, feel free to drop me an email, give me a call. I know this is kind of introducing new concepts for people, and it can be sensitive and all, and this stuff will kind of stew in your head. So please feel free to reach out if you'd like. I also would like to offer to you, getting back to the part of the integrated change leader I talked about, understanding change concepts, processes, and tools. I do have a set of free training video series that you're welcome to sign up for at changemanagementfundamentals.com. The topics are right there for you. You get a good sense of what some of the key things that I've learned over my career, keys to successes, those rookie mistakes that many of us have made, including myself, and 3 frequently asked questions by leaders about leading change. So just go ahead and sign up. You'll get emails. You'll start getting emails with links. And those training series often get quite a lot of, the people find them very valuable. So, and then the third thing is I'd like to offer you the opportunity to receive my newsletter. Sent out every couple months. It's usually full of tips and tricks about change leadership, motivational messages. You can go ahead and type your email in the chat box if you'd like to receive that, and I will get you on my list. And Marie, I'm going to ask you to be watching that chat box for anything that comes in. Lastly, just remind you, this is your journey, and nobody else is going to be able to go through this learning journey. You are your own unique person. You're wonderfully made and have really unique skills to bring, life experiences to bring, and it belongs to you and you only alone. But some of these quotes I love, Simon Sinek, you probably know some of his stuff. The greatest leaders are not the strongest, but they're honest about who they are and their weaknesses. And they don't see themselves as great. They see themselves as human. Marianne Williamson, I love this. It takes courage to endure those sharp pains of self-discovery rather than choose to take the dull pain of unconsciousness that would last the rest of our lives. And finally, Brene, again, when we really have the courage to walk into our own story and own it, we get to write the ending to it. So I just want to thank you all for your participation and joining me tonight and allowing me to share what I'm really passionate about, and allowing me to be transparent with you and your participation and comments and everything. I know we could spend hours in my mind talking about this stuff, but I really appreciate all of you and I wish you the best of luck.
Beacon is the premier executive networking organization serving the Mid-Atlantic region. To learn more, go to beaconforlife.org.